Hello everyone, my name is Katherine Weare. I have the honour of being the curator of this series of talks about contemplative education. This talk is part of the second series in which we're looking at how do we implement contemplative education in the real life settings of schools and universities, moving on from the principles and the theories that we talked about in the first series to say how does it work in practice. And I'm talking today about taking a holistic perspective and how do we embed and implement contemplative education within a holistic view of schools and universities. And it turns out to be perhaps trickier than we might have thought. There are two other talks in this particular second series about embedding contemplative education in whole school approaches, one from Iceland and one from Israel. So I will today be stepping back from the detail and looking more at what we know of how it works. So what do we mean by holism? Well, to start somewhere very simple, it means a way of looking at the world in which you focus on the interconnections between entities which are more than the sum of their parts, rather than looking at the world as a lot of discrete, separate parts that have to be understood in isolation. Now, holism's got a very long pedigree. If we go back to the core of Eastern wisdom, which is so much of interest to Mind and Life Europe, we see that the Buddha had his theory of dependent origination, which suggests that everything is connected with everything else. You can't separate out one part. If you do, everything changes, and that cause is complex. I guess the modern summary of that would be the butterfly effect. Change one thing and you change everything. But it's not just Buddhism that had this insight. Rather nice quote here, you might like to wonder who it came from. Education of the mind without education of the heart is no education at all. It's not actually His Holiness the Dalai Lama, though it could have been. It's actually Aristotle. So the idea of the interconnected whole person goes back a very long way. And we do, of course, have the whole tradition of whole school approaches to educating whole people, educating the whole child, their hearts, their minds, their bodies, their spirit, their values, not just their cognition, and using every kind of educational method and approach that we can imagine in creative and flexible ways, not just sitting them down in classrooms and drilling them full of facts. So the whole child approach has got a very long pedigree. Now, if we come to look in more detail at what we mean by a whole school or a whole university approach, I think we have the World Health Organization to thank for this particular theory. Back in the 1980s, the WHO was very keen on the settings approach. I'm sure they still are, in fact. And by the settings approach, they meant that we stopped looking at health, and they were looking at health, but by health they mean something very overarching. We might prefer now to call it flourishing or well-being. When we look at health, it doesn't work to just look at everybody as isolated individuals making rational choices about their own well-being. We have to look at the contexts which shape health. And they have a lovely quote which says, "Health is created and lived by people within the settings of their everyday life, where they learn, work, play, and love." And that's from the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. And that insight gave rise to the healthy cities, healthy hospitals, and also the healthy school movement. Now, of course, neuroscience is a very connective discipline, and there's interesting discussions there about the relationship between the parts and the whole. I've just finished reviewing the evidence for the impact of mindfulness meditation on various bits of the brain, but was very struck by a comment by the man who wrote the best known summary of this work, which is the complex mental state of mindfulness is likely to be supported by large-scale brain networks. And that links us immediately with the insights of Ian McGilchrist, who's been developing the well-known theory that the brain has two hemispheres, and that the left brain is better at the details and the right brain is better at the whole. And he's developed that theory into a whole social commentary, really, discussing whether we in the West have become much too left brain oriented and are missing out on the wisdom of the right brain. So we can see that this all has a very long pedigree. Coming up to date, we have the work of the Dalai Lama and his Education of the Heart, and his very lovely C-Learning program, which is combining systems theory, social emotional learning and ethics, and you'll be hearing more from that in the third series. So it feels kind of obvious that holism is best, but that's not always the case unless we implement it well. And the work I've been engaged in trying to develop these large whole school, whole settings approaches shows how tricky it can be. If we're going to create settings with congruence, where everything does pull together, where people practice what they preach, where the ethos is in line with the aims, it's not easy to do. And I had a strong experience of this back in the 1990s when we were developing whole school approaches, and the evidence was showing that they were the most effective. So there was many major frameworks developed right across the world. I was part of two of them, the European Network of Health Promoting Schools and the Social and Emotional Aspects of Learning programme in the United Kingdom. But there were others, such as Mind Matters, an excellent mental health programme in Australia. When I say excellent, the theory of them was fine. They were based on sound evidence, they were excellent principles. But we found when we implemented them that they didn't always work in terms of outcomes. And what we realised is that taking a holistic approach is just the starting point. And you have to get the details right, because if something is more than the sum of its parts, you nevertheless need to know what the parts are. And you need to determine what are the crucial factors here in implementing in a holistic way. And I'd like to spend the rest of this talk looking at what seems to be two crucial principles. One is developing the skills and capacities of the people who live and work in these settings. And the other is making sure that what you're doing is embedded in the world that you're trying to transform. I'm going to look now really at the evidence, particularly around mindfulness, which is just one part of the contemplative approach, but it's an important one and perhaps where there is the most clear evidence. So by mindfulness, I mean approaches in education which teach people to be more fully present in the here and now with what is happening, with a particular attitude of kindness and care and open-mindedness and curiosity, taught through practice, often mindfulness meditation, taught through a whole person approach, looking at the body as well as the mind, and very much reinforced by what happens outside of the meditation room, off the cushion, in people's everyday lives. And we know that these kind of approaches build 5 core mechanisms, and that these are absolutely foundational to everything about our lives, including education. And I'll just quickly run through the mechanisms themselves, and then I'll link them up with some of the core features of education. One is attention. The ability to keep a focus, to not be distracted. And this is absolutely vital, because if we go through our lives being distracted, with our minds wandering, our lives just disappear. There's a very real sense in which our attention is our lives. What we pay attention to is the quality of our lives. The second mechanism is metacognition, which is a word that I'll use in this context to refer to the ability to stand back from the thought stream and to look at it more objectively, to notice thoughts coming and going, to realise they're not facts, to de-centre, to get it that we are not the centre of the universe. There are other people whose lives are equally important and equally real, and start to build towards the third mechanism, which is compassion for ourselves and others, a sense of common humanity, of being fallible people all doing our best. And that is a very powerful and important recognition of what really matters. The fourth mechanism is emotional regulation, which is partly created by the ones I've looked at already, the ability to watch our thoughts and feelings come and go, to manage our impulses, to be with rather than to respond, to relate to difficult experiences in a new way with curiosity and kindness rather than being driven by them or thinking that something has to be fixed straight away. And all of these capacities come together in what's been called the master competence of self-regulation, our ability to manage our minds, our bodies, our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviour for the common good and for our own good. Absolutely crucial. Now, all of these are really fundamental to the core aspects of education. And just to move the focus from the mechanisms to the core aspects, learning. We can't learn anything unless we pay attention. We know that the attention is absolutely crucial. Metacognition, vital, so we can start to look at our own habits, our own preconceptions, our own biases, and to think more clearly. Emotion regulation. We know we can't learn if we're not ready to learn, if we're not settled. We know that stress turns off many aspects of the mind. The more sophisticated thinking part of the mind disappears when we're under stress or trauma, and we just become a reptilian fight, flight, freeze. So I'd like to move on now from looking at the mechanisms in isolation to looking at how they relate to some core aspects of schools and universities. We need to recognise that schools and universities are basically about learning, and we forget that at our peril. And these mechanisms are absolutely crucial to learning, including traditional didactic teaching and learning. We can't learn unless we pay attention. We know that that is absolutely vital. Unless you can get your students and yourself to pay attention, nothing's going to be learned. Metacognition really helps with our ability to stand back from our thoughts, to recognise our own biases and our own preconceptions and start to look at reality. Emotional regulation, vital for being ready to learn. We know that when we're stressed or traumatised, our brains just don't work effectively. So all of this means that contemplative education is actually moving into the heart of the process of teaching and learning in schools and universities in a very transformative way. Mental health and well-being are becoming vital to schools and universities, back to the knowledge that people don't learn unless they are happy and balanced and settled. All these mechanisms are vital for mental health and well-being. Metacognition helps us to recognise ruminative, depressive, anxious thoughts and to stand back from them, to get some handle on them. Emotional regulation, having strategies to reduce our stress levels and to cultivate better responses to difficult situations. Self-compassion, vital, particularly for teachers who tend to be very hard on themselves, believing they have to fix all the ills of the world and that they have to be superhuman. It really helps with mental health of teachers and students. Teacher effectiveness, really helped by mindfulness practice. Helping teachers to pay attention really helps them to keep track in the classroom. Moving from an emphasis on themselves to other people helps them to de-centre and to start to teach students rather than the subject, to teach the people in front of them instead of what's in their minds. Self-control in the face of the snowstorm that comes at you when you're trying to teach, and to manage your feelings, particularly when you're faced by difficult and challenging behaviour, and to realise that this is an opportunity for learning rather than necessarily something to become punitive about. And as I've said already, self-compassion when it all goes wrong. And this is why good CE programmes so often start with the teachers themselves, because their skills, their capacities are at the heart of contemplative education and also the good school. And finally, all of this relates to the overall school ethos that we're trying to create. We're trying to create schools where people feel at home, where they feel accepted, where they don't feel judged, where they feel that they matter, where there's a value system of respect and kindness and compassion, and where there's open-mindedness and flexibility, and the willingness to learn and change. These ethoses are very important in the whole school approach. So to sum up the key points I hope I've made, effective whole school approaches need close attention to detail. They don't just happen. Particularly crucial are the skills that we teach, which lead on to these crucial mechanisms of metacognition, attention, self-compassion, self-regulation. And if we get that right, we start to have a situation in which mindfulness and more broadly contemplative education start to move into the heart of the things that matter in schools, to learning, to well-being, to teacher effectiveness. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that that was of interest and value to you. Thank you.